Hi, my name is Richard Curtis. I'm an imaging solutions consultant here at Adobe. In this video today, we're going to look at the workflow between Lightroom and Photoshop and a more advanced use of smart objects and how you can increase the use of non-destructive editing in your workflow. I'd like to just reiterate what a smart object is. Essentially, it's just like a container of information. That could be any layers inside your Photoshop file. What we've seen previously is using a raw file and its metadata on any changes that have come from Lightroom, and then at any point in time later we can go and re-edit the Lightroom adjustments. One of the most common things that people do in Photoshop is composite images together, which may be as simple as putting a background in another picture. And today we'll do exactly that and show you how you can use smart objects to help with that process, but also use some of the filters now that are non-destructive on that smart object. And again, keep that non-destructive editing workflow process running without having to rasterize early into the PSD or the TIFF. Using smart objects also increases performance inside Photoshop. Rather than Photoshop having to go down the layer palette and manage all the layers, you're basically putting all those layers into a container and you're going to work on one layer, which is much faster for Photoshop. So you'll see a benefit in performance and speed when you're working with smart objects inside Photoshop. Okay, let's look at these two images inside Lightroom, and I'll show you the workflow of how we bring them into Photoshop for compositing, and then how we can cut an image out and use a background from another image as its background. Now, this isn't the only workflow. There are many workflows that you can incorporate as part of this process. So this is just giving you an idea of how you can use the smart objects and how you can use multiple layers and how you can wrap them up and keep that process non-destructive for much longer. So here's some of the pictures that I shot in Bhutan a couple of years ago of this festival. And you can see this chap here with a mask. And I'm going to use this image and replace the background. I want to put a scene of people there rather than just the landscape vista that we have. And actually the image that we're going to use for that is this one here. So I need to bring them into Photoshop, and I'm going to bring them in as smart objects. So even if I make adjustments inside Lightroom for each of these separate photographs, I can then re-edit the individual elements later if I need to do. So to do that, I'm just going to right click and edit in Photoshop as a smart object. That's the first one loaded into Photoshop. And I'm going to open the second file into Photoshop as a smart object as well. Before I do that though, I might want to make some adjustments inside Lightroom for this picture. So I move it into the development module, and I'm just going to, this was taken with an old process version of Lightroom, so I'm just going to update that to the new version by going to Camera, Calibration, Process, and change it to be 2012. This will then load the image with the new profile settings or the new adjustments that I have now in the 2012 version of Lightroom. So I'm just going to open up the shadows a little bit on the face of the mask. I'm going to recover any highlights. I'm going to set my white point. I use the Alt key to see where I'm starting to clip. And I don't want to clip on the mask itself. And I'll set the black point, and I'm just going to set the black point to where his eyes go black, just like that. And now I'm going to open that up into Photoshop. I might use clarity later to give this image boost, but I want to be careful about how I do that and where I do that. So let's open up this image here and open it in Photoshop as a smart object. So what it does inside Photoshop is it will open it up as two separate canvases. So ideally, I want to have both of these smart objects inside one canvas, which is really easy to do. All I'm going to do is undock one of these canvases, move Photoshop out of the way, and I'm just going to drag the crowd scene into the other canvas, redock the canvas, and get rid of the crowd scene, so I don't need it anymore. And then I'm just going to reposition this in place just by dragging it and dropping it in. Okay, so you can see there that we've got two separate objects, and each one has got its link back to the raw file settings. So if I double click on this one here, you can see it opens it up into Camera Raw. This is going to be really handy if I want to make adjustments to individual layers, even after the composite's been made. So I'm just going to move these two layers around because ideally I want the mask, or the person with the mask, on the top layer. Now I'm going to use a new feature inside Photoshop called Focus Area. One of the most common things done to a picture inside Photoshop is to cut something out or select an area. And inside Photoshop CC, we've really worked on different ways of doing that and making that selection much easier. You could, of course, just use the Quick Selection tool, but the Quick Selection tool is based on contrast between the edges. This selection will be made on the depth of field of a picture. You see how I've got parts of the picture in focus and parts out of focus. So I'm going to use that information to make the selection. So I choose Select, Focus Area. And Photoshop's going to analyze the picture and then automatically pull out everything that's in focus and make a selection for me. You can see that Photoshop's done a great job in making the selection based upon the depth of field. So all of this is in focus, and so is the shoulder. But some of the scene and some of the body is actually out of focus. So I can control the depth of field that the focus area is using to make that selection. As long as I have the plus enabled on the focus area dialog box, I can tell Photoshop now to go pick up this part of the scene and use this depth of field as well to make the selection. So a couple of areas that need correcting, which I'm now doing, just basically telling Photoshop to select parts of the scene. I can also use the minus sign to remove any information that I don't want if it has picked up too much. So I'm going to go over here and just make sure that the hat is in. Okay, and you can see that it's done a pretty good job. I'm going to output this to a layer mask. That layer mask is going to cover parts of the smart object and reveal parts of the smart object. Before I go into there though, I want to refine that mask, just make sure the shoulders are all as part of this selection. So I'm going to use Refine Edge. Refine Edge has been there for quite a while inside Photoshop, since CS5, and it's a great way just to make this edge a bit smoother and the transitions smoother. So I'll just run this over the edges of the parts that I need to smooth out. And you see there it does a really nice job of blending all of that in for me. Once it's finished doing that, I could continue on and work with the edge detection and the edge here, that information I've got here, but I can also do that later with the mask in isolation as well. So I'm going to output to a layer mask and press OK, and you can see there it updates the layer mask for me and automatically cuts out that picture or cuts out that object as part of that scene and then puts the background in place. If I want to work on the mask, because there may be some areas of highlight around that mask, it makes it look a little bit unreal, I can fix that. I can click on the mask itself and then go into Mask Edge. And if I go into Mask Edge, I go back into the Refine Edge mode of the mask, and I can then change the mask if I want to do. What I'm going to do though is I'm just going to use the mask and I'm going to Gaussian blur the edges, so it blurs off the edges much nicer, so when I'm cutting this out it looks more realistic. So I'm going to choose Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and notice it's black and white. This is because it's now showing me the mask and not the image, because I'm actually parked on the mask itself. I'm going to keep this at about 3.3 pixels, that seems okay to me. And I can actually turn the preview on and preview off so I can see how that's affecting the image underneath, and press OK. It may be that you get some highlighting around the edges, some white. I'm just going to select the mask this time, and I'm going to Image, Adjustments, Levels. And what I can now do is I can alter the mask based upon the black point and the white point. Remember, black conceals, white reveals. So I can smooth this out and get it exactly where I need it to be, just to tighten up that mask a little bit. And there we go, press OK. I press the Alt key to bring on the mask, to bring that back, and you can see there's a nice blend of this image with the background. Now, if you look very carefully, the image has some out of focus areas on it. In the real world, if we're looking at this, we want to continue that depth of field out into the crowd. It makes no sense to have a focused area here and then this out of focus, and this in focus. The beauty of having brought this image in as a smart object means that not only can I go back in and re-edit the raw file, but I can actually go in and apply a filter to this layer. That filter will use the new blur gallery, and I'm going to use the field blur onto this picture. So as you were changing the depth of field in the camera on the aperture, I can now do this in post-production to make this scene fit the foreground scene that I have. So I'm just going to alter the depth of field and make it really blurry, about there. You can see I'm using this on canvas widget, and to make that adjustment I could also use the value here and the slider here, but this is much more intuitive to use this, especially with a pen, and press OK. You can see now that the background is all out of focus, but what's happened here is the blur effect, or the blur filter, has been applied to the smart object, which means that I can either use the mask to mask out parts of that blur, or if I'm not happy with that blur, I can at any point in time just double click on it and go and edit it in real time and make it a bit more blurry. And at any point in time in the process, I can now go in and re-edit any of those filters that I use in that smart object to make that effect much more realistic as I'm working on the go. And don't forget, we can always go back to the raw file to change the raw file a little bit later on as well. Now we want to be able to blend this scene together, and I can blend them together based upon the colour information, not on anything else, not on the luminosity or anything, just on the pure colour, just to make them so they blend together, because the colours are slightly different. So what I'm going to do is right click on both of these layers and go to the flyout menu. I'm going to convert them to a smart object. Remember I said you can actually wrap layers up as a smart object. So now I'm reducing the file size by zipping these two layers up and embedding it into a single layer. I can now use that single layer and work on this image as a whole rather than two composite parts. So all I'm doing inside the PSD is zipping it up effectively. And you can see there I'm left with this single layer. Now I can go in and I can apply a blur average, and I can change the way that the average is blending. And I'm going to I can change the way that the average is blending the scene by changing the blending mode to be color, and I need to reduce the opacity because there's too much, to about 12%. And you can play with this, depends on what works for the image that you're working with. And you want to refine this as you're going along. So press OK. Now of course, now I've done that, I can then sharpen this picture up, or more importantly, I can actually start balancing this out by using the camera raw filter. So now I'll go into filter, camera raw filter, and I can use the camera raw filter to work on this image as a whole. So now I can go into the shadows and pull all the shadows out of the whole scene, not just of individual components. I can set the white point and the black point, again by using my Alt key, to work out what's clipping, what's not. So you might want to put a lot of black in there, but you might also want to use clarity, and I can use clarity to boost mid-tone contrast to give me that extra punch, more dimension to the picture. Of course, I can do things like my radial filter if I want to put more focus in the mask. So I could draw a radial filter here and place it over the face of this character, and I can then dial the exposure down at the background to give him much more impact into the scene. I can also go in and I might want to put a vignette in to darken the edges. That keeps me in the frame. Because I've put on the effect of the radial filter, you might not want to do it. It really depends on what you want to achieve. But I can just go into the effects panel and dial it in, and you can see it darkening down for me. It also may be that the horizon's slightly twisted. So I can go in here and I can perform the lens correction and use the new upright technology to correct this. It's been very, very slight. But if I press automatic, you'll see there's a slight shift. It just corrects this image for me. And then once it's finished, I can press OK. Now all of that has been done on the camera raw filter to the composite of both of those images that came from Lightroom. But at any point in time, I can go and change the way that the average filter is blending. I can go and change the camera raw filter and change the vignette and change the radial filter, change the highlights, shadows and clarity. But also, if I double click on this layer containing the original mask and the original objects, I can go in and modify the mask. But I can also go in at any point in time and modify the raw settings that came from Lightroom. So here you can see I can just change the dial the blacks down because I'm doing the blacks later. I can change the blacks, change where the white point's clipping and the shadows. And when I press OK now, those changes will come through into this composite. And if I close this down and save this and re-zip it, if you like, or recompress it for the smart object, the effects will then get bubbled up, and effectively it will then need to go and rebuild the smart filters because I've changed something. But all that will be handled by Photoshop, which means I've now got a great non-destructive workflow all the way from Lightroom to Photoshop. Even with Composites, I can go back at any point in time and change the raw settings, or I can use the camera raw filter to go and enhance the image further by using the Lightroom adjustments that we've been used to all of the time, but this time in Photoshop on multiple layers. So there you have it. There's the final image. You'll probably do a lot more work with this, but it's just really to show you how that can work. But remember, this isn't the only workflow. There's many workflows and many things you can do, but really enables you to work non-destructively on your images and keep that non-destructive editing process alive for a lot longer without you having to go in and commit to the rasterized TIFF or the rasterized PSD file or that rasterized image earlier in the workflow. So actually now I can keep my PSD file as a PSD file intact, just in case in the future I need to go into it and modify anything in the image at that future point in time. So there you go. We think that's a really great workflow, something that you can adopt yourself and work with that. So thanks very much. I hope that was useful, and we'll see you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye now.